This is Andy Gutierrez from StarWars.com, and you are listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Z. This is the podcast you're looking for.
This is Ashley Eckstein, Ahsoka Tano from Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Z.
Joining us today for a cup of coffee to talk about the 7th episode of Andor. The episode is titled Announcement. I've got two returning guests to Coffee with Kenobi, although it has been far too long since we have talked to both of them. First, Kelly Knox from StarWars.com, and she's also the author of so many great books, Star Wars, Marvel, and otherwise. Kelly, welcome back to Coffee with Kenobi.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
You bet. It's great to see. We actually got to meet in person for the first time at Celebration in April, so that was a fun surprise.
It was. I was happy we recognized each other, even both masked the way we were.
I know, it's very true. This other guy, I saw him at Celebration. I've seen him in quite a few other places. He's a good friend of mine. We are both often when Lou Mangello on WDW Radio talks about Star Wars, he brings in me and our other host for this evening, Ryan Donoho from the Forcecast. Ryan, welcome back to the show, bud.
Dan, thanks for having me back, my friend. And it's good to say long time no see, because that means I got to see you back in May, but it has been a long time. I'm glad to be on Coffee with Kenobi with Kelly and with you and talk about what I think is the best episode of Andor so far. So I'm very excited.
Wow.
Okay, well, you know what? Let's just start with that. I normally do a letter grade because, of course, I'm a teacher, and this overall reactions to the episode. So let's start there, Ryan. You say it's your favorite episode. Is it an A+?
It's an A+. I feel like I'm not one to have any complaints about the series so far. I think it's got its very distinct tone and very distinct way about it. It is a very particular style of series. And so in this very particular style of series, a lot of times the buildup is very long, right? Like there's a very long buildup, a lot of talking, a lot of setting up, a lot of exposition. And it feels like now that we hit mid-season and now we're on I guess now we're going down the roller coaster, some of those things are starting to pay off. And some of those webs are starting to intertwine. And some of those different things are all starting to happen. And by the end of this episode, you could kind of see that, okay, I understand why they set up this a certain way or why we saw this character go a certain way. And now the questions are starting to flood in. Before, it was almost like I was letting the show come to me. Now my brain is starting to sort of, there's gears inside of it starting to crank going, oh, wow, I wonder what's going to happen here. I wonder what's going to happen with this character. So when they have this type of show where the buildup can be pretty long, when it starts to pay off, it makes it even sweeter. And so that's how I kind of felt, where I was glued to the screen for the entire episode.
Right, which I believe, is it the longest episode of the season?
I think so.
If it's not, it's got to be pretty close to the top. Kelly, what about you? A letter grade and overall reactions to this episode?
I mean, every episode is an A. I would give this one an A. It's only not an A+ because Brasso, the MVP guy, didn't show up, and I was kind of hoping we'd see him again. But we did get to see Bix again, and of course B2. So that was always that was great to see. But yeah, A. Probably by the end of the season, I'll say, oh, this episode set up so much more stuff that I wasn't aware of yet, and it would be an A+. But yeah, I love every episode, and this one, especially going back to Ferrix and seeing Andor with Marva again. All of it was perfect.
All right. Well, that's some high praise as well. I would think I would give this an A+. And the reason why, if you were asked me to describe this episode in one word, I would say Galactica-esque. This episode reminded me of Battlestar Galactica, the newer version of Battlestar Galactica, because of the intrigue, because of the interior machinations of several different parties, both on the side of the burgeoning rebellion as well as the tyranny of the Empire. And there's just so many plot threads working together, but this is not like a sitcom or your typical half-hour or hour-long episode of anything. There's just the writing and the intrigue is just so sophisticated. I feel like it's not really a bold claim anymore to say this is the best written overall consistent Star Wars storytelling that we've ever gotten. back to back to back to back to back. I think is that too crazy of a claim, Kelly? Am I drinking too much caffeinated beverages over here?
Maybe, but no, I don't think it's too much of a of a wild claim to say that. You do feel like every episode is connected to the one before it, or 5 before it, and it's a great, not a linear story, but like I was saying, there's like a connection to everything that I think we might not always get because of so many different styles of different series. Like Mandalorian can vary from episode to episode, but this one is pretty consistent.
Yeah, it's Ryan, is Andor your favorite Disney Plus Star Wars series?
That's a tough question.
Probably an unfair question.
It's definitely the one that I'm most I'll put it this way. It's the only Star Wars series I've ever turned captions on while I watch. Because there is so much dialogue for almost like something like I wouldn't say it's pointless at all, but it's setting a tone with every piece of dialogue. If you think about the cereal scene a couple episodes back, right? That type of scene would never be in another Star Wars series. Like in like a series like Kenobi or even The Mandalorian, which can sometimes be a slow burn. You would never see that, but there's so much exposition and so many things going on that it's like the first time we've ever seen in Star Wars, period, because George Lucas is certainly not a man that would have dialogue like this or set up like this. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's my favorite yet. I'm going to see what happens with the first season and see where that goes. But it's the first one that I've ever it's making me think on a deeper level outside the lore, right? Normally when I'm watching Kenobi, I'm thinking about the lore and what that has to do with Darth Vader and A New Hope. And this one, I'm very hyper focused on this particular story. I'm not necessarily worried about like Yularen was in this episode, and I didn't even realize it until like later on, and I'm like, oh, that's cool, and that's all I kind of thought about. I wasn't thinking about what that means for the Clone Wars. I'm still so hyper focused because the dialogue really makes you kind of hyper focus on this and the story and the setup. That this particular story is so compelling. It's the first Star Wars series I've ever watched where even when I'm watching The Mandalorian, oh, is that Snoke in that tank, or is that what's it mean for the First Order, or what is this and that, right? And now, I'm not thinking the first couple episodes I was, and then now I'm I actually don't. I'm not having those thoughts. I got to turn the captions on. I don't want to miss a word of what's being said. And it's a unique watching experience for me for Star Wars.
Highly recommend watching the captions for everything because it will give you names and planets and different things that maybe you thought you missed. I like how you phrase that. For me, it's really nice to be unshackled by the mythology in a story that's very much ensconced in the mythology, but from the dark recesses of Star Wars that you just sort of, your mind may sometimes go there throughout the 40 plus years, but you don't really see it. You mentioned Lauren, there's this great speech, like at the very, very beginning where he says, the criminals responsible for last night's atrocity think they've taken the Empire by surprise. We know better, as it shows everyone getting dressed and ready. When they discover how ready and eager we are to respond, I'm kind of reading the captions as I do, is to be prepared to be here this morning. And we know that the only question we need to answer is how tight to close our fist. I really like that a lot. This is why we plan. This is why we work so hard when we're at peace. So, Kelly, what are your impressions as you see this build up and the really nice shots of people, getting dressed, putting their boots on, marching into the ISB? It's not a throne room, but their conference room. Tell me kind of what went through your mind as you're watching that opening sequence.
I think this show is probably one of the best series I've ever seen that does show don't tell. And I think setting up the scene with Cyril talking about wanting his collar higher, and then they immediately cut to the Imperial officer's collar. Like that one little bit, like it was either foreshadowing or it was just showing you maybe what Cyril really wants, or, it's just enough to make you think about what they're trying to say without saying it. And I really think that this series excels at that. So just seeing first that switch from Cyril at the table talking about having his suit tailored to, the ISB officers getting ready for the meeting. I thought that was just brilliant. I don't know if they're foreshadowing that he will join the Empire, but that's the great thing is it's not beating you over the head with that imagery, right? It's still just asking a few more questions that you might not have thought of otherwise.
Show don't tell is exactly what you do in your writing, which you should do in dialogue. The Empire has this new. They're basically going to put all their cards on the table with force. They're going to ask for things like a tribute tax equal to 5 times the amount stolen from Aldhani, which of course all happened in the episode of the Eye. Everyone's shifting around. Any sector that's harboring partisan activity, they're going to make it very, very clear that no one is going to steal from the Empire. Everyone is just so fascinated as they're saying this. Any custom, festival, tradition is a cover for rebel activity. It's going to be ixnayed completely. It's going to trigger permanent revocation of imperial tolerance, which is a pretty scary thing when we know the Empire is not a tolerant people. And then Yularen says, I spoke with Emperor Palpatine last night. In which the Palpatine tells him ISP is going to go take the lead going forward. No one in this room has trouble accessing army or naval resources in the future. So basically, we're talking about a government. A government is probably an interesting turn of phrase for what the Empire is, I suppose. But they're basically saying, much like what I think the First Order does in the sequel trilogy, basically saying, hey, you know what? We don't have any rules anymore. We're going to do whatever we want, whenever we want, because we are justified, because you have been attacking us. It's hard not to watch this stuff without thinking about real world politics and things that have gone on in recent history. But Ryan, some really powerful stuff here that we know is going to cause some serious problems and provoke the rebellion into growing.
I'm glad you said that last part, because they're in my notes that I wrote. It says it's almost funny because we're seeing to them sort of a change in the Empire here, that if this rebel cell activity that we start to see pop up is going to become more and more serious, because of course they have laws about anti-imperial actions. We hear about that at the end of the episode, but like to have real rebel cells making this sort of an impact that they did on Aldhani, they're trying to show that they're prepared, but what we know in the back of our mind is that they don't grow or change or anything like that. And in fact, when you become this way, where you mentioned there's no more rules and it's kind of, we're going to do what we want, we're going to squash this, it kind of creates a lawlessness in a different sense, which allows the rebellion to exist in there. Because when you get rid of the rules and the order and the calm and measured approach to things, that's where the rebellion starts to, like you said, it inspires people. You saw with Marva the inspiration of, now I'm inspired. What I saw, that I'm now going to stay here and I'm going to walk down that path that I used to avoid, so on and so on. So it's like they are trying to show so much that they're prepared, that it creates this lawlessness and it creates this uprising, and they never learn. We know that they never learn. And it's funny to watch it, because to me, that shows that they're actually unprepared, because a smart, well-operated government empire response to things would take a measured approach and say, okay, let's look at what we have here. But no, is it immediate, get the boots on, here's the plan, we're going to do this. We see at the end of the episode, like, it used to be 6 months, now it's 6 years. We're just going to do all these different things that we've lost our sense of order, which is ironic, because the Empire's whole selling point is we bring order. And then with this type of reaction and this type of actions to things, it actually creates the opposite effect. And they're so, I guess, obsessed with their agenda that they don't actually see what they're really doing. And that really is the reason why the rebellion continues to grow and exist.
And it almost starts to make sense when you see Rebels or the ending of Solo, or just things that we know about Star Wars in general. It kind of makes sense now where the grit comes from, and where there's no, whenever I've looked at the rebellion, besides Saw Gerrera, I've never thought about hate as a fueling factor. I always thought about it as like, righteous indignation at how they're being treated and refusing to let themselves be governed and treated this way, and to express their rights as people. But here you just start to see how anger is fueling it. You feel like you see that a lot from Luthen, his conversation with Mon Mothma, which we're going to get to. But Yularen closes this meeting by saying any criminal act with even indirect effect on the Empire, just indirect, like happenstance kind of things, is going to be branded a Class 1 offense. Now, I'm no lawyer, especially in the world of a fictional galactic universe, but that doesn't sound very good. So I just love the ominous setup. But ironically, at least when I'm watching this, Kelly, I didn't feel myself more worried for the rebellion. I guess we have the benefit and the luxury of knowing where that's going, and that they have a New Hope on their side, even though he doesn't know it yet. But it just really sets this wonderful tension. I don't even know if I even have a question here. I just want to just sit in my hammock and stare into space and say, wow, this is a really great show.
It is. It makes me think. So I've been, the thing I love the most about this series is, yes, we know what happens to Cassian eventually, but we don't know how he made it to the person that he's going to be in Rogue One. And
right.
Like many people thought it was going to be Nemec maybe in his manifesto that, ended up being what spurs Cassian to join the rebellion, but it doesn't seem after watching this episode like that's the case. And it's making me wonder if it's that anger that you're talking about because of the sentence that they're imposing on him on the end. Is that what's going to turn him into the rebel? Like, is it that 6-year punishment that he got that came out of nowhere?
Yeah.
Is that going to be the turning point? Because so far he obviously, he hasn't found his cause yet. And so that's
he's a tourist.
What I think. Yeah, I'm just a tourist. And so I feel like that's the point that I'm really looking forward to us getting to, is what makes him want to actually join the rebellion, and then what actually gives him the hope that he's fighting for. And I feel like every episode we get just a little bit closer. We're not there yet, but it makes me so excited for still what's to come.
I think Daedra here steals the show. Speaking of excited for things to come, because the way that she is just resolute, similar to Cyril, but she appears to have, she certainly got more clout and a more consistent confidence within herself. I think that's fair to say, even though Cyril will always have our hearts to a degree because he introduced Cyril into the world of Star Wars, which is, what we've all been dreaming of. But I really like this sequence right after the meeting when she says, this is exactly what they want. We're playing into the rebels' hands. They want us to think of it as a robbery, but her assistant says, Hurt says, what is it? And she says, an announcement. Whenever you see the titles, I feel like in these episodes of Andor, Ryan, they pay off. Announcement, I think, is a great word for this, for the title of this episode, because we see announcements throughout a lot of different interactions, and we've been kind of going linear, but we can jump anywhere you want. Kelly brought up the whole tourist thing with Cassian at the end, but talk about the different announcements you see in here. Because if I were writing this, and I'm clearly not, instead of saying announcement, I think I would have said ascension, because I feel like everyone takes a step forward in their progress, in their goals, and in finding liaisons or cohorts to work with to kind of meet their own ends.
Well, I will say that in my notes, I actually wrote that the beginning of this episode, the reaction to what happened on Aldhani was almost like a broadcast, right? Like they don't have access to the Imperial Holonet. They don't have their own. I mean, the rebellion at this point isn't even a rebellion, right? There's no alliance yet. It's, we know from Rebels, there's a bunch of cells and eventually an alliance forms. But at this stage, there is no governing body. There's no sort of council. There's nothing for what we know becomes the Rebel Alliance. So how do you get a broadcast out to the galaxy that the rebellion is real, that there is some force fighting back against this? And this action Aldhani, they continually show and repeat that they heard this on the news, right? B played this for me on the news. You hear Marva say, right? It's almost like a broadcast, as much as it is an announcement, saying, hey, we have arrived, right? They're announcing that, but it became a broadcast because everybody heard about it on the news, right? In that sort of, it's like an antique shop, toy shop, whatever you want to call it. That when he says, do you have anything from Aldhani? Luthen's reaction right away was just like, he runs back to the back room because he can't contain himself. So to me, it was like a broadcast to the galaxy that this is real. But at the same time, because you talked about ascension, everybody taking the next step, you also immediately start to see that now there's going to be competing styles, right? Because in my notes I wrote, you have the Saw style versus the Mon Mothma style, right? And that's a current storyline through this story. But it also does remind me too that you talked about real world politics. It's starting to also show sort of the reflection and the reality that to fight back against an oppressive regime like the Empire, the forces that fight back against it are going to be messy. You're going to have different styles. You're going to have people with different interests, right? Like Cassian helped that that mission on Aldhani, but he had a motive that didn't have anything to do with rights or the Empire. He wanted money and he wanted to get out of here. But yet, so it's messy and it's complicated. And so this broadcast really sort of announced to the galaxy what's going on here. And now you start to see the different reactions to those with people like Mon Mothma and her approach, and then maybe some other folks' approach. And it's going to be, that's to me what was so great about this episode is you started to see the seeds of where folks that were aligned will they still be aligned, even though they have the same goal. So that's what I loved about the sort of broadcast aspect of it.
I like the broadcast idea is apt. I like that a lot. There is a party that thinks of it from like a Funhouse mirror version of Ezra's in season 1. When he makes his announcement towards the end of that first season. Let's switch gears and let's just get to the Luthen and Mon Mothma conversation. She goes back to his shop, and they have a kind of a no holds barred conversation. Kelly, highlights for you from this conversation. What do we learn from both of them? I think there's some interesting stuff with how they handle this situation that I would hope that we can see if we can get to the bottom of.
I think Luthen knew exactly what was going to happen, and he thought of it as an announcement too. Like, I think the Empire played right into his plans. I'm not sure it was as much about the money, although that seems important for the rebellion, as just announcing themselves to the galaxy, which I don't think Mon Mothma was prepared for at all, I don't know what's going to happen with her family, which I find fascinating. If she's going to want to leave them, like why she's playing it still so cautiously. I'm so curious about what she's afraid of losing in particular, because she doesn't seem happy at home. She's definitely not happy as a senator. And so I think they're showing her, she's definitely not ready for any sort of announcement herself. I think in a small way, she was at least inspired to go through with that meeting with her childhood friend at the party, which I think was a really, probably a big step for her in the rebellion. And so I think, I don't know if his words maybe sunk in a little bit, or maybe just the entire, maybe their entire conversation kind of stuck with her, where she was able to take her next step in the rebellion and just, reveal just a little bit of what she was really up to her friend from Chandrila.
Yeah, I feel like her conversation with her friend is probably the most important thing that happens in this episode. But I think with Luthen, why is Mon Mothma so surprised? Like she's operating kind of from a place of fear. I think it's because, and maybe it's just a no-brainer, but just following my train of thought here, I feel like she wants revolution. She wants to stand up to Palpatine, but she doesn't want innocent people to die. Luthen seems callous here. I have a hard time believing that he's callous, but he's certainly hardened by whatever has happened to get him from wherever he came from to wherever he is now. And Ryan, I wonder kind of what you think. If we have Luthen in our psychologist chair, he's our patient. What do you think he's operating from?
So I think the conversation between Mon and Luthen was so interesting to me because the reason why I think the Rebel Alliance wins at the end of the day is because it has a little bit of both, right? We just talked about the Empire. They have no measured approach. It's okay, crush everybody, right? And Luthen, I think, sees that. He's like, listen, whether we take your approach, Mon Mothma, or you take mine, people are going to die regardless. So do you want to do what it takes to get the job done? Or do you want to just sit on your hands and wait till it's too late, right? I think that's the conflict she has with Saw Gerrera in both Rebels and in Rogue One. But I think we find out through Rogue One and through Rebels that you kind of need both, right? You kind of need Mon Mothma's approach to take that measured, smart, let's think about what we're doing here approach. And you need a little bit of Luthen's approach of like, listen, we're not dealing with people that care about lives. So they're gonna do what they're gonna do regardless. We might as well make it hurt. We might as well take those chances, because if we don't, it might be too late. And so I think you see those two conflicting styles where I think Luthen genuinely does care about, innocent lives and what the Empire is doing. But I think he's operating from a I don't want to necessarily say realist approach, but at least one that he thinks he knows the outcome regardless. So we might as well make these choices because innocent people are going to die anyways. The Empire is going to do what they want to do anyways. So we've got to be ruthless. We've got to be just take the fight to them. And Mon Mothma, I mean, look at just the way they get funding, right? If the Aldhani thing was about funding, the way that Luthen's approach to get funding and the way that Mon Mothma at the end of the episode's way of getting funding is two different approaches. Both might have the same end goal of getting access to more funding for the rebellion, but look at Luthen's approach and look at her approach, right? And so that's going to be that kind of sets up this conflicting storyline between two allies that have two different approaches, two different styles. But my guess with Luthen is that I think he genuinely does care. I think he doesn't want innocent people to die. But I think in his mind, at least, I'm going to be realistic and say, listen, it's going to happen anyways. So if I wait for you, Mon, then I might have missed my chance. Aldhani would have never happened. This broadcast, this announcement would have never happened. I think he even says to her at one point, basically, I'm just saying out loud what you already know. Yeah. And then that's kind of how the conversation ends.
Mm-hmm. He says turning back will be impossible. Kelly, were you going to say something?
Mm-mm.
Oh.
Just agreeing.
Oh, yeah. No, he says turning back will be impossible. Yeah, I don't think there's a callousness to it. I think it's more like we're battle hardened and it's time. Like it's time. There's no turning back now. And he says what was said earlier, that, you know what, this is what we want. This is what we want. The network's being built up. He says it grows or it dies. I think perhaps, and he also says we've waited long enough, but I think the most interesting thing about this is that the woman who, do we have a name for her yet? The woman who seems to be like someone working with him or for him, as the episode plays out and she seeks out Vel on the surface of Coruscant, she seems like she's even more cutthroat than Luthen is. Don't you think, Kelly?
Yeah, I think her name is it Clea?
Oh, that sounds right.
Yeah. She is ruthless. Just just her watching her walk to her meeting, like you got that sense that she was exactly where she wanted to be. She was not afraid, and she was going to say what she had to say. And that whole exchange between the two of them, it almost seemed out of place in the episode. So I'm looking forward to seeing like how that interaction is going to play out. Like, if Andor is in prison, does that mean he's, off the hook for Vel coming after him? I feel like that set up so much that I have so many questions about, and I'm pretty excited to see where the next step of that path goes for Vel.
This is Vanessa Marshall, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
Same with me. When Luthen earlier says the Empire's been choking us so slowly, we're starting not to notice. He wants to invoke fear. He wants the Empire to force their hand. And I think, when she says to him, Mon Mothma says to him, people are going to suffer. He doesn't want that. And I don't think that what was her name? Was Clea? Is it Klea?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. It really is. I agree with you. It's be interesting to see kind of who started this whole thing. Like I keep expecting Saw Gerrera to show up, and I'm sure he's going to eventually. You almost kind of wonder who would he side with if he was in the room with Luthen and Mon Mothma. Where do you think he would stand, Ryan, if he was there in this conversation?
Probably Luthen. I think Mon is probably going to be on an island through most of this, because once the announcement's made, once the broadcast is made, everyone's fired up at this point. So I think you're not going to find a lot of folks that are looking to be measured or be patient, because everyone's really starting to feel the effects of the Empire. And that's where it's such an interesting topic. Are people like Saw Gerrera and Luthen, are they extremists, or are they people that are a little, maybe just think that you have to fight fire with fire and not fight fire with a water hose, right? There's so many different ways you could look at people like Luthen, and now his like you mentioned, sort of his his crew that seem even more cutthroat than he is. You know, you look at the way that Saw Gerrera operates in Rogue One versus how the Alliance operates in Rogue One. Like, you put like sacks over people's head and you don't know where you're going, and then next thing you know, you show up to this unnamed hut and you've got this crew where the Alliance has Jyn in handcuffs, and they you know, they kind of talk to her, and such a different approach. So that's actually what I think Tony Gilroy in this series is going to explore, because that was explored in Rogue One, the difference between the extremist approach and the diplomatic approach, and where those need to align. Like, if you think about Rogue One itself, which is why I love this idea of the two different approaches, is like the actual attack on Scarif was not approved, right? It was people saying, all right, forget it, we're doing it anyways. And so I just think, to me, that's the most interesting dynamic. That's why I think why I love this episode so much, because I loved it. Because, you know, like Mon and Luthen were kind of on the same page, and they were like real polite and cordial, and now stuff is getting real, and now people have to make choices. Like, now people have to make choices of what they're going to do next, where they're going to side. What does Mon Mothma's Senate career look like? You know, I don't think Luthen's going to be hanging out in that shop much longer. Let's just say that. Like, I think he's going to have to do that. So personally, I think a lot of folks are going to be on the Luthen side of things, just because once the passion is there and once the reality is hit, I think natural reactions to thing are to join the fight when you're in that kind of cause. So I personally think Luthen.
You almost wonder if Saw Gerrera will be in the middle, or maybe he'll be so extreme. I don't know. I mean, I think it's just realistic, because even when you're like-minded, you have similar goals, you actually want, I feel like there's altruism somewhere deep down inside, but they've been hurt by a lot of things, a lot of oppression. And now the Empire is basically saying, we're not going to hide it anymore. They're like, it's almost like you're shaking the beehive because you want the bees to leave to their cage. It's probably not the best metaphor I could think of, but I'll work on that. Kelly, we meet Tay Kolma. You referenced this conversation before. I said a little bit ago, I think this is the most important part of the entire episode. At least it landed the most for me. I feel like it's Genevieve O'Reilly is absolutely a tour de force in this particular scene, especially. She's just very charming and elegant, but there's real fire in her eyes. And I love the way that she speaks with her friend. Again, his name is Tay Kolma. Talk about their conversation and key things that stand out for you that you think are going to be important later on.
So I thought it was interesting, the conversation. They kept cutting to Para and her husband, and he was talking to a different woman every time, which was its own little subtext, I think, happening at the exact same time. And he didn't seem, I watched him to see how concerned he was about her conversation, because she was obviously having a pretty intense conversation, and it didn't look like he noticed her at all. So that was fascinating. I think that she and Tay kind of danced around each other for a while, but I think they are going to ultimately be on the same page. It's not the kind of, Andor isn't the kind of show, like we were saying earlier, where you're going to see like the cameo pop up and then the reference to this guy, but I can't help but wish that Bail Organa had been at that party, because I don't personally know where he would fit between the Luthen and the Mon Mothma. You know, if those are your two ends of the spectrum, like where does Bail fit on that? Like, I feel like he's probably way more towards the Mon Mothma side, but I would love to have see more of what he's been up to, because we didn't get much in Rogue One. He just kind of came out of the shadows, and in Obi-Wan Kenobi, he obviously has his hands full with what's happening with Leia. So even though it's not like that's not what they're going for with this particular Star Wars series, I would have liked just to have seen maybe Bail mingle a little bit during that scene. But otherwise, yeah, I thought that was a very played, quiet but intense scene that's giving us a hint that Mon Mothma is probably going to start making some more serious moves pretty soon.
Well, speaking of that, and I'm going to ask you this one too. You're a mom. You have a daughter, right?
And she's 13, just like Mon Mothma.
Okay, that's even better. I thought that was about the right age. Tell me about, because to me this, I mean, there's obviously a little bit of history that we don't know about, but I feel like you could take whatever the tension is between the two of them and place it anywhere. It doesn't have to be Star Wars, but it has nothing to do with Star Wars or a fictional universe. this is sort of a mom-daughter thing, or I don't know. You are definitely the more qualified to answer this than either I or Ryan are.
I did have to pause it after he said that's a difficult age because I knew exactly how old she was, and I started laughing, and I was like, yeah, I think just from personal experience, yes, it is a difficult age because 13 is right in between, still a kid, but still, wanting to be the adult, but they're just not there yet. And so, but I feel like, at least compared to my 13-year-old, like you can still feel that divide between Mon Mothma and her daughter. I think that maybe isn't natural, or I don't want to say that's not normal, but I think it's definitely strained past like the typical teenager, assertion of independence. I think there's maybe something else that they need to confront with each other there. I don't know if she'll get the chance. I'm curious to see, because we know when we find Mon Mothma, she's all by herself. So at what point, how does she get there? It's another fascinating question that Andor raises that I'm really interested to see where it goes. When I found out she even had a daughter, I thought, like, where is she? Like, how would Mon Mothma decide to leave her family and her daughter? And so I know they're setting up the strained relationship to make that maybe a little more plausible, but I don't know. I'm still interested to see where that goes.
You almost get the sense that there's a lot of hurt. Perhaps what her mother's been doing, as far as we know, through no fault of her own, is just cause a bit of a strain because maybe she's not always there for her daughter. And it's very clear that her husband, who, in addition to being a complete jerk and desperately wanting to look like Qui-Gon Jinn, also appears to be one who stirs the pot. And it's like he's playing her just like a cat with yarn, just to see them hurt. And I think that's one of the bigger, this series ultimately is about tragedy leading to rebellion, and you're seeing it sort of on a microcosm level as well. And perhaps that will be the tipping point for Mon Mothma. I really want to look more at this recruitment with Tay. Ryan, I know you like you're fascinated by the political intrigue side of Star Wars for sure. Talk about how I mean she recruits him, but I almost feel like even though he doesn't set out to recruit her initially, he's so intrigued by her in his mind, her complete turn of what she stands for. She's been so good at fooling that she's fooled her lifelong friend. I just think this is just a beautiful dance, verbal dance between the two of them.
Yeah, I think that whole party, I guess, is interesting to me because with the family dynamic, with having to go to a lifelong friend, it also really shows that if this is such a zoomed in look at the galaxy at a very minimalist level of, like, we're talking about marriages and parenthood and all these different things and how it can impact somebody. That whole party is like this is what people like Luthen maybe don't understand, right? Like, to my knowledge, he doesn't have a family, he doesn't have a kid, he doesn't have a wife. Like, he's pretty mission driven, where all of the choices Mon Mothma has to make has to take her whole life into scope, right? Like, I'm a senator, I am also a mother, I'm also a wife, whether the guy sucks or not, technically she's still a wife. Like, every choice I make, I can't just recruit a bunch of people, pay them, get them on a ship, and go blow things up and steal money from the Empire. Okay, I just cannot do that. So here's the way that I do things, and she has to take all of these things into account. Like, when she's setting up to talk to him about needing his help, like, the setup was such a long setup because she has to be careful with every word she says, right? Like, only 3 people in the galaxy know this. And when he says that my politics might be a little too strong for you, it's almost like a light bulb went off in her head. And it was like, perfect. I was waiting for the moment to when I knew I could trust you to ask you this thing. So yeah, it is also, like you mentioned, interesting that, like, he was also there to kind of see what's been going on. So I just like that whole setup. At first, I'm not gonna lie, because I've been watching, or I've been reading the captions because I've been hyper focused on everybody's facial
Mm-hmm.
expressions and everything. At first, I'm not gonna lie, I'm like, do I even trust this dude? Like,
Yeah, same.
is he working for the Empire? Like, is he? Because she was saying everybody's watching me. They replaced my driver. You know, they did all these things. They're listening to everything I say. Like, is he in on this? I mean, I think I trust him, but even then, it's like Mon Mothma can't even necessarily trust lifelong friends. She has to wait until it seems like he's cleared whatever test she had in her mind. So that whole party, like Kelly said, was really great to watch, because it's the dynamics that she has to deal with, and it's making her character even more multidimensional, than, you know, we're somehow, even though we've started to see even Genevieve O'Reilly play her multiple times, we're learning more and more about how she operates and the things that she does. So I just love that whole sequence, and I still don't know if I trust this guy. I think I do. But it is interesting to see that, like, how she has to approach talking to somebody, right? Like this dude Luthen flies all the way to Ferrix to go to Cassian because he hears he could be useful, and does all this stuff and just recruits him and puts him on a ship and drops him off on a mission where Mon Mothma has a lifelong childhood friend that she has to sit down and pretend to smile while she's talking to. So those dynamics just to get something done, you know, and I think the family thing is going to come back, and it's going to have to be a choice that she makes. So I think that whole dinner scene was sort of how we got to see a day-to-day operation of Senator Mon Mothma and what she has to deal with, and the different dynamics. She has to have her head on a swivel constantly. And she says it earlier in the season about she has the most to lose in this, right? She kind of she's closest to this danger. And that's why she takes such a measured approach. So yeah, I don't know. I think I trust him though. Bottom line is I think he's legit. I think he's going to help, but still the back of my mind, I'm like, after seeing, you know, the aftermath of Aldani and two people die, and even like I was even like in episode 6, like, do I even trust this doctor? Like at this point, I'm on full like intrigue. Like, who do I trust? Who do I not trust? So that's the way I've been watching this show. I'm like, do I trust this guy? I don't know if I do. You know, was that a smile?
You're channeling your inner Cassian, I think.
Yes, it's got us feeling like we're in the show. I'm like, is that a smile? Is that a wink? Did he look off camera to somebody? So I don't trust anybody at this point.
Well, I trust him completely. I think it's because of the way he's like, well, I think I've been drinking too much of this punch that your husband made. Speaking out of turn, because you know you're with these Imperials all the time. You're with these people all the time. She says, no, I'm a polite, sometimes indecisive senator who spends her days fighting and failing to protect separatist do-gooders. And his face is like amused. But as time goes on, it's like you're starting to open him up, and he's like, I made you angry. She's like, no, you've actually set me free. I've been wondering how I could sort of confide in you. And I feel like during this moment, I feel like her posture changes, and maybe it's just the way she's presenting her argument, the way she's talking with this like silent, almost deadly conviction that's with a lot of charm and charisma behind it. It's a dynamite acting moment to see her do this. And when I watch this sequence, it makes me want to watch Rogue One again and just watch the Mon Mothma parts, because you kind of know, now that we're actually seeing, she's more than just this polite, charming older woman from Return of the Jedi who says many Bothans died to bring us this information, right? There's so much more to her now. She's so much more interesting. And she says, look, I want everyone to be the irritation. Then that means if everyone's looking at me, they're going to miss what I'm doing, which is a very similar statement to what Luthen says earlier about daggers and rocks, right? About if they're looking at the rock, they won't see the dagger in my other hand. Doesn't Luthen say that earlier in this episode?
I think so.
I thought he did, unless I'm confused. I mean, maybe I'm confusing it with something I'm teaching. It's very, very possible. All this wonderful fiction kind of starts to blend together. It takes a long time for Cassian to even show up in this episode, by the way. If I'm correct, he doesn't show up until, let's see, there's about 26 minutes into the episode. It's the first time we see Cassian Andor. And then he has his reunion with Bix, and I feel like that doesn't go well. It's really heartbreaking. But I'm sure it's something we're going to come back to. Kelly, talk about this scene and sort of what stood out to you.
I I thought she was hard on Cassian, but that he deserved it. I thought that it was interesting they got out of the way that yes, these two had a history. No, they're not a thing anymore. Like I thought that was a nice touch to just get that kind of confirmed in there, and then as part of their conversation about Tim, yeah.
Tim with two M's.
The only thing, yeah, Tim with two M's. I guess I was only a little sad because I was kind of hoping there'd be more Bix. I just like her so much, as a character. But they seem like they left things kind of for a while. So hopefully she comes back. She might not, but I was glad that he at least went to see her, even though the entire time he was on Ferrix, I just kept thinking, "What are you doing? Get out of there! You're staying there too long." Like I was honestly surprised that he even went back, which I think shows you how much he loves his mom, Marva.
I agree. During this conversation, there's a couple of times in the episode where they just jump to a different sequence, and we see this man going out to try to keep the people of Ferrix sort of under control as these appears to be clone troopers or clone trooper armor anyway, marching along, and then it looks like he's going to be killed for trying to tell everybody just to settle down. What's that about? Is that did I miss something? I don't think I missed something, but maybe that plays it because there's like a kid with really dark hair that's watching it happen. I don't know if we're supposed to believe that that's Cassian, or is it?
No, so there's it's in the they've established that his father was killed by the Imperials I thought it was for protesting, or maybe they thought he was protesting now, is how they've changed it. But in the Rogue One visual dictionary, it mentions that in particular. So that's Cassian as a boy watching his father Clem. So it's a flashback to when so those are clone troopers, because Cassian, I think it also says that he, like, that was his first bit of rebellion was against clone troopers, throwing rocks at clone troopers and things of that nature.
Oh, that's right. I remember that now.
And so I think they were flashing back. Yeah. And so they were flashing back to that period of Cassian's life, I think. But I think it was triggered by the sound of the footprints, the stormtroopers' footprints.
That makes sense. So then, since his dad's name was Clem, then
he uses his dad's name.
Yeah, did he make up that name, or did Luthen give him that name? I think he said.
I think he made it up. Yeah, that's the name he gave when I asked him that.
But that name is tied to the book Great Expectations by Charles Dickens too. By the way, I want to look at that book again before I kind of explore what I think might be going on there. Okay, because there's another sequence too where we see someone hanged. People are hanged, pictures are hung. That's the grammatically correct thing there. But so that was his dad, right? Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought. So again, more evidence of why he hates the Empire so much. But let's talk about his conversation with Marva. It's a really rather long scene that eventually ends with Daedra's rise in the ISB. And then apparently a massive fast forward into the future. So there's three main sequences. I know our coffee's already running kind of low, so we'll try to fly through these if at all possible. But Ryan, which one do you want to talk about? You want to talk about the big ISB sequence? Let's talk about that, and then we'll talk about Marva later. How about
that? So I thought that at the end of this episode, they kind of set the path for each faction of characters that we are following, right? The ISB, Cassian, Mon Mothma, Luthen, and even Marva to a certain point, but I think that we may not see much of her moving forward. I think there's probably going to be some closure there, but I don't think it'll be much. So, obviously, when they make Deidre in charge of sort of
she's like the supervisor now, right? Isn't that her?
Yeah, she's like the supervisor, and he says to her, "Watch your back," because I think she's going to go to Ferrix, right? Did I misunderstand that, or is that's what's about to happen next? Is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah,
it's certainly under her jurisdiction now.
Yeah, so obviously, I think they're setting up for something to happen there. Sorry, got to gather my thoughts here. So I do think that might be sort of the closure that we get with Ferrex, with Bix, and with Marva, because if she's leading this sort of response to Ferrex, and she believes that there's this connection between the robbery and Ferrex and all these different things that have been happening, I think she's going to be a very interesting character moving forward. And I do think at the very end, when you saw Cyril sort of kind of end this episode, I do think you're going to see a dynamic between what the ISB is doing in response to this, and now that she's in charge, now that she's a supervisor, and how Cyril might react to that and how he plays that. So I thought that was a dynamic storyline where I think those webs will cross and those paths will cross. So, it is interesting to watch the inner workings of the Empire at this stage, because I don't think that most of them are used to doing this type of work, right? Like, you didn't used to have these type of reactions and these type of rebel insurgencies. Right. So she's like earlier in the season, I mean, she's been running into problems of not being taken seriously when she's trying to investigate the Rebel Alliance and this secretly forming Rebel Alliance, and now she's kind of being taken seriously, and that's going to be an interesting thing moving forward to me to finish out season 1. Where does that lead, and where do they go from there?
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Key moments for you with the mom. I mean, for me, I think that's cool that I feel like BT, yes, BT is a droid, but BT almost feels like a dog that's a robot, like super fiercely loyal, expressive in his own right, completely wants best by his owners or his people. And I feel like we've seen, obviously, our cup runneth over with droids in the world of Star Wars, but I don't know. I was pretty vocal earlier on, like, BT is just another droid, whatever. But not BT, but this one, I don't know. This part kind of charmed me. In addition to this very mature woman, this very mature attitude of saying, you know what, you can't stay and I can't go because I'm older, but I'm going to fight. Like, I'm going to fight. I thought for sure he was going to say, well, I did that robbery. That was me. Like I thought there would be this moment of them bridging this little gap they have, this rift between each other because of his recklessness, and her starting to see that his recklessness may have a point, even if he doesn't realize it yet. But yet it doesn't happen, and I'm glad it didn't, because I feel like there's more story to tell and more threads to dangle for us as viewers. But there's just a lot of beautiful stuff here, Kelly.
Mm-hmm. I liked when it was really subtle, but when Andor walked in the door, like you said, B2 is so beloved by both of them. Andor just put his hand on his head, like just as a quick little, like a little pet almost. And I thought that was just such a nice little touch. Just by Diego Luna, probably didn't even think about doing it, but it just seemed so natural. I think I was saying earlier, like, Andor's obviously not at the manifesto level of the rebellion, right? He is not on the, like, that. He has no ideals. He has no, he's not there at the rebellions are built on hope stage, right? So how does he get there now if it's not, he and Marva didn't have that moment, and the manifesto that Nemec gave him didn't change anything. Like, there's so many questions I still have, and I think, it might feel like we're slowly getting there, but we're absolutely getting there to see where Andor's, where his passion, I think, and his hope eventually come from.
I agree. We talked about Data's ascension, but then something interesting happens. We get this sort of fast forward. It's and even with these birds flying over this ocean in this really funky, unique music. We're on a planet called Niamos, a really lovely looking planet. But this is like as Miami Vice as we've ever seen in Star Wars for sure.
I saw somebody call it Space Florida. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I think that absolutely tracks. Well, Ryan, someone who's actually in real Florida, not Space Florida, I find myself watching this, not knowing what's going on, being blissfully happy that I had no clue, because that means it appears that this next few episodes going forward, we've seen a time jump, and I think that's been very much alluded to through different interviews that have gone on about the series Andor. So where do we go from here, Ryan? I mean, fill in whatever you noticed. I mean, we see shore troopers, we see casting with yet another woman. There's a lot going on. but I'm looking forward to seeing kind of how this unwraps itself.
So what I loved about the jail sentence is that means somebody's got to break him out, right? So we talked about those two characters earlier who met and talked about Cassian, right? And they have to kill Cassian. Is it them on search for him, realize he's in jail, and then realize he can be useful? Or, like we said, the ISB could be heading for Ferrix. And does that mean Marva makes a sacrifice and Bix leaves to go find him and Bix breaks him out of jail? Or like not to get too speculative necessarily because we have no idea. But the beautiful thing I liked about that is someone's got to break him out of jail. So who is that going to be? And is that his breaking point? Is him being broken out, like him being sentenced to 6 years in jail, make him go for a guy who's just trying to get away from all this and make some cash? Because you said he didn't admit that he was involved in the robbery, because I don't think he wanted to be. Like, I don't think he wants anybody to know that, like, to him, that was a job. It's out of his brain. See you later. Goodbye. That was nothing more than, I want some cash. And I want to be able to use this cash to make my own life and get away from all this. And getting sentenced to 6 years in jail when you didn't do anything. He's done plenty of stuff to go to jail for, but not this, right? Like, so it's the 6 years in jail, or at least jail for the Empire, I guess. But, you know, when you go to jail, when you have no say over things, does that make him realize? And then when whoever breaks him out of the jail, do they help him also realize? Is that when he turns the manifesto? So that was, you know, I loved the visuals of that whole thing, the whole beach planet, shore troopers. I believe the captions called it a KX unit. I love seeing that. Like that's when it had such a beautiful mix of the Andor style of Star Wars. It's so different, while also being like, man, this is Star Wars. There's shore troopers and KX units, and you know, so all of that was well done. But my takeaway from this episode is, now we've got the fast tracked for the last few episodes of season 1. Someone's got to break him out of jail. He's going to have that turning point. What happens to Marva? What happens to Cyril? What happens with the ISB? What happens with Bix? Because I don't think this is the last that we've seen of Bix. And I think that history is going to be why maybe we see her again, because she's too valuable of a character to just kind of leave there. So my mind, the reason why I gave it an A+, the reason why this is my favorite episode, is because my mind is now racing, really for the first time all season. Cool. Because I kind of just wanted to let the series come to me. Now I want to come to the series. Now my mind is just racing for the first time through the 7 episodes. So I love the ending, and I think it sets up perfectly multiple storylines for multiple characters.
That is an excellent closing statement, my friend. Kelly, that's hard to top, but I have faith in you. Anything that kind of stands out here at the end, or any closing things you want to say about this episode of Andor?
No, that summed it up really well. I think seeing the threads finally come all together, Cyril and Andor finally coming face to face, I think could not be more suspenseful at this point, because you know that we're following him for a reason, and Cyril doesn't know it, obviously, but something's going to happen to bring the two of them together. Or you know, is Daedra going to be the one who meets Andor first? Like, how they're going to bring all these together, I think it's just going to be absolutely something we can't even predict or prepare for, and I can't wait to find out what it is.
Agreed. Absolutely agree. It's delightful because, again, this is, I mentioned a few episodes ago on Coffee with Kenobi, this entire thing just feels like a Tolstoy novel. It's just like, it's so intricately interwoven, and there's a lot of sides of gray, but you could also make a case as to why the Empire thinks they're in the right. Not all aspects of the Empire, but some of them, they're just so convinced and they're so compelling that while we, as, you know, respectful human beings, would never join the Imperials, you start to understand. I think that's the brilliance of it, and you also see some of the dark side, and I don't mean that in a forced way, but the sort of the darkness that almost is required sometimes to fight back against this, and how it can sometimes consume you, as we do see with Saw Gerrera. We keep talking about Saw Gerrera; he doesn't even appear in the series yet, but of course we know that he will because of the previews themselves. Either way, a brilliant episode, and the two of you, of course, were masterful as always. Such a delight to chat with both of you about this episode of Andor. Kelly, thank you again so much for coming back on the show. Where can people reach out to you if they want to talk Star Wars or just catch a funny Star Wars pun?
You can find me on Twitter at Kelly_Knox. You can find me on StarWars.com. And my book, or co-authored a book, Star Wars Every Day, is coming out on October 25th. So
That's right. Be sure to grab your copy. I was just going to say, please plug your book. So I'm glad that you did. And it's available wherever books are sold, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Well, we're very excited for you. You continue to inspire us. Thank you for that.
Oh, thanks.
Speaking of inspiring, Ryan, thanks for hitting home runs for us, brother. As always, please let us know where they can find you and tell us what's going on with the Forcecast.
Dan, always a pleasure. You can find the Forcecast anywhere podcasts are found. They're not necessarily sold, so not we're sold, but we're found. Obviously, we're the official podcast of theforce.net. Our website is forcecast.net. We're pretty much Forcecast on all socials. We're going to be doing sort of a halftime show for Andor that we're going to record tomorrow. Just sort of where are we? Basically, now we're a little bit past the halfway point, but how do we feel? Kind of like a halftime show for if it was sports. How do we feel at halftime? And how do we feel like how this game is going to end? And then obviously Tales of the Jedi is right around the corner. And let's just say in the last few days, my excitement meter has gone through the roof. So I'm excited to talk about that. My favorite content is prequel era content. So I cannot be happier about Star Wars right now. Seeing live action Clone Troopers and then seeing Tales of the Jedi in a week is going to be just heaven for me. So thanks for having me on as always, Dan. You know, we're buddies and you can call me, and it was great to talk to Kelly for the first time. It was a lot of fun.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.